rounds of discussion. So TPP and WTO and these sorts of things. So we looked at the suggestion was to look at indigenous groups who have the non-evit government, I think it was suggested. That was the Presbyterian Church. We got into the PKK and other organizations which established lines of trust, pods like Giveth and so on. I think these were in the counter examples, but I have written down here mafias and cartels. I think these were the examples of people that we don't necessarily want to learn from, but flat, non-hierarchical structures, or at least decentralized structures also. And then emergent organizations, so whalers, apparently, 19th century whalers, hard to have that conversation now, but OPEC, the Maghrabi traders, diamond dealers in New York, guys who through a common interest have come together, common maybe financial interest, and organized, self-organized. So these are Lawlessness and Economics was the title of a book that we're supposed to look into. And then so breaking that down, these are organizations organizing around either shared idea or a shared notion of enforcement or a survival imperative or common financial interest or strong leadership. So we can pick which of those most accurately mirror the kinds of organization we think we are, arguably, the ideas, organizing around an idea, and then go and approach them. And what questions do we have for them? Well, things like what tooling do you have, what communication strategies, how do you define your membership, how do you resolve conflict amongst your members, what does community mean to these groups, and how do they get a sense of their community? Decision making around money is an important interrogator. Crisis management and the difference between whether they have a war footing and a peace footing. What does governance? Is governance only something that comes to play when in times of crisis? Exclusion and punishment for violation of norms is another thing. So how to get these questions answered? The main point is have more conversations like this. This is a living, breathing workshop. That's the plan.
Thank you. That was great. For the next folks, we're going to try to keep these around 4 to 5 minutes. That was right on time. So thank you. But yeah, just for reference, and I will give a quick kind of note once we're getting close to that time. So the next session to review, EIP process and role of EIP editors. Do we have a note taker for that session? Or okay, great.
Okay, so yeah, we talked about the role and process of EIP editors, had a basic overview of how something goes from an idea, more formally put into a draft, either gets accepted, rejected, goes to a final form, and eventually merged. There were two ideas that came out of this conversation. The first was a web page of EIPs or ERCs that are considered done by their authors. The page is refreshed every 2 or 4 weeks. And the idea is that there's a 2-week last call period for all of these EIPs or ERCs. Each of these EIPs or ERCs would have ideally their own repo where anybody could come in and say, hey, we think this is off, or this won't work, or this is wrong, whatever it might be. The editor goes through and looks at the concerns, and based on the sort of IETF standard of rough consensus and running code, if it seems like the thing will reasonably function and there's reasonable consensus around it, then it gets shipped. If not, and there's issues, it gets knocked back to draft form. The second idea was basically how to prevent the drafts list from growing ever longer. So you can imagine like someday we're at EIP 1 million and there's just like a giant backlog or an infinite stack of these things, so how might you avoid that? The idea here was a change to the naming system where EIPs or ERCs no longer get unique numbers at the beginning. Instead, they have a naming convention where it's the person's name and then potentially a 2-word description. And they only would get a number for core EIPs once they're accepted and non-core EIPs once they enter a final stage. 2 other just like interesting observations that came up for this are things that I personally learned. One is that there's one guy who's writing the vast majority of the tests for most things at the moment. This guy Dimitri, who apparently is a saint. So thank you, Dimitri, if you're out there. He has like a small team of people who contribute occasionally, but like that seems like a reasonable bottleneck for the whole process. The second is that there are 5 active human editors at the moment, who the community probably owes a great debt to as well.
Thank you, Fred. The next one here was the making forks less dire.
1 second, please. Can I just ask if you're not like something very important, just to believe in your connection, because I'm running very low with my video.
You guys really need internet?
So I took notes from that session, how do we make forks less dire? Similar to the other sessions, like a lot of questions came up initially. So we discussed different classifications of forks in various ways, like scheduled forks, emergency forks, different classifications by stakeholders, like what could be suitable classifications of forks first. Then discussed how to achieve coordination between the actors as like a relevant factor in how to make forks less dire. Differences in like the software fork compared to the fork of the governance mechanism or the community split. General learnings from previous forks and how they played out. Other things we discussed was what are things we can learn from? So marketplace design was brought up, but the fact that governance and dispute resolution is much harder to design. And then a lot of the discussion at the end went towards how to minimize the cost of hard forks. And we discussed and brainstormed a few ideas. So clearer governance of trademarks is one of the ideas. So who owns it, like who can and who owns it, and who can decide like what is supposed to be called the particular platform going forward. The other thing was how to give certainty and improve for coordination. Protocol version numbering was one of the things proposed in that context. Otherwise, in general, standards like EIP as a mechanism to reduce cost around hard forks and finding consensus. Yeah.
Next session was what is the community? Do we have a note taker or anyone who is present for that session who wants to summarize it for us here? Hudson, the floor is yours.
So we tried to define what the community was, and we couldn't. That's it. So what we did do was we did write on the board a number of actors and participants in the ecosystem. So like miners, government regulators, dApp developers, dApp users, core developers, full economic nodes. I'm probably missing a few others. And what we tried to do, which we didn't completely accomplish, was figuring out where all of their incentives aligned to where we can consider them as part of the community. What is it to be part of the community? And it's really a multi-dimensional answer that is a little bit too difficult in one session to figure out. But what we did get to was that it's a complex topic. There's a lot of different actors and organizations and entities inside of this community. And I guess something that could help us better map out the community itself is called power mapping, where you basically have what looks like an organizational chart of all the major entities and groups that are active in the ecosystem and how they relate. So for instance, we could do it for clients and have Geth parity, the Python client, JavaScript client, and have that mapped out. And then over here, miners and major mining pools, and map it out. So that can kind of help define the community in a mapping way, but not really define community as a definition. So that's pretty much how the session ended. So we didn't accomplish exactly what we intended to, but we got some cool ideas and discussions out of it.
And I was there as well. And one comment that I want to point out, not to a specific person, but it was suggested that perhaps community is the wrong word. Perhaps maybe it's like stakeholders or something more broad that includes people who certainly have an influence over the governance process without necessarily, say, being supportive of Ethereum, or being more neutral with regards to their stance towards Ethereum. So we took that idea and carried forward with that list of entities to a later topic, which we'll review after this next one. So the next topic was funding, security, and ongoing development. Is anyone in there? Rick.
Yeah, so we had a pretty tangential conversation. I'd say it was very similar to the community one, where I don't think we really came to any strong conclusions. We really just kind of formulated the discussion and figured out the key points, and we kind of broadened the scope to common goods in general, not just security or any of these things, but things like we talked about these common goods being like developing core clients and incentivizing full nodes and rent on the blockchain, things like this. And we kind of came to these three questions, right? Where does the money come from to support these things? Where does it go? And what is the governance around how it gets from one spot to the other, right? So where the money comes from, we talked a lot about on-chain and off-chain, right? So you can, we do have an opportunity coming up with the switch to POS to really drastically change the mining rewards. And maybe there could be, one thing is like Dash has 10% of the mining rewards go to a fund. You know, we could, maybe there's potential to do something along those lines where a reward, either a transaction fee, a portion of a transaction fee, or a portion of a block reward goes to something to support these the development of these common goods. We also talked about what's already happening, gathering money from the community through Ethereum Foundation has a bunch of Ether that they use to support things. The ECF and ETHPrize is funding an open source block explorer right now. Nest grants are being given out, so there's lots of individual people and organizations that are already supporting some of the common goods, because in general this is a tragedy of the commons issue. So then deciding where it goes was a really interesting topic, because we really couldn't come up with anything solid, but you know, some kind of proposal system, or I mean, it kind of is attached with the governance of how to decide. You know, these two questions kind of go together. So basically right now with the Ethereum Foundation, there's anyone can apply and say, hey, give me a grant for this and that just creates way too many options and a lot of overhead to decide where to put the funds. So having some kind of filter in front of it. What ETHPrize is doing right now is really interesting, where they're interviewing 100 people, developers in the community and other people who have a good perspective, and kind of aggregating that data and then putting out bounties for specific things that they want done. And that's another option on how to decide where money goes. And then the governance of making that decision. Who's the stakeholder in creating that decision? And it's like, well, obviously the people who are on the off-chain governance side, it's pretty good to just say the people who are giving money get to decide where the money goes. But then on the on-chain side, that's a real big debate, right? Do we DAOify? What happens with those funds is, I don't know, up for debate. So this very early discussion, planting the seed, and hopefully it will continue further.
Thanks a lot, Rick. So the next one here was the community consensus discussion, or mapping stakeholders to signals. Reese?
So we started talking about what consensus means versus rough consensus, which is more just like, people in Reddit were talking about this, or in Twitter or whatever, versus actually having like a formal way of reaching consensus that is accepted by the whole community. Then we determined some of the stakeholders, as Hudson I think was saying, that need different ways of signaling their will and signaling their intentions. And we sort of went through a lot of different signals. Some of those signals are triggered like before any of these governance decisions happen, and some are triggered after. So for example, for ETH holders, we talked about transaction volume in the network. We talk about if there is going to be a fork, doing a prediction market on that fork and seeing how the markets react to that. For dApp developers, we talked about a number of metrics, such as the contracts deployed to the network, the number of ERCs being created, the GitHub activity, and also it's very important to note here that dApp developers should have a lot of importance and voice here, because some dApps basically break if they are in different networks because of the network effects. For example, think about DAI splitting and what would that mean to a stablecoin. We also talk about public statements in general as a way as a very important signal. So by project leads, core developers, also like price is another signal. For miners, the hash power, also statements, and maybe the signaling, similar to how they do signaling in Bitcoin, for example. For dApp developers, there was an idea regarding if you have a contract that has a lot of usage on the network, you can have more weight on, on coin voting, for example, or something like that, with the transaction volume you have in your contract, which basically means that you have a lot of dApp, users on your dApp. We also talked about an idea for not only doing coin voting with Ether, but also ERC20 tokens. And we talk about how to weight that based on market cap, based on other factors, because if you base on market cap, there are some funny situations in which, for example, EOS holders may be able to subvert the whole Ethereum network or something like that, which we don't want to happen. We also talked about how you can have these contracts or these multi-sigs actually do coin voting by having some forwarding interface in which they can basically take input from the users, voting from the users, and then forward that signal to another coin voting contract. We talked about, for core developers, certain default flags, for example, default flags in the clients, like in Parity or in Get, what is the flags that you define, like the fork that you want to go to in your users by default. We also talk about bounties, signaling for features, grants as a signal on features that are needed. Also commitments to other chains forced by code. For example, if you commit to another fork and you burn your Ether in the main chain in a way that they will exist in another fork, it's a very strong commitment to another fork. And finally, we just talked a little bit about how to aggregate all of these signals, and we talked about websites similar to the ones that are in the Bitcoin community, where you can see a lot of the statements, and you can click and see the citations and see the actual blog posts from the companies. Also, maybe like some kind of aggregators that can be open source that can list all of these different metrics, like transaction volume and all of that, in an open source way, so you can verify them. Also, like maybe building like a TCR both of signals or of aggregators that can show this data to users. Maybe a wiki, you'd have some kind of web page, and also we can do automatic collection for signals very easily. So for example, transaction volume, all of that is very easy to fetch. And also an idea someone had is that wallet creators can actually poll their users if we do some coin voting, like, hey, take a minute to vote on this issue, which can have some other issues, like people not caring at all, for example. And finally, we talked about the importance of giving grants for these aggregators that need to be open source and verifiable, and basically having some market for aggregators that show this data and so, this proposal has this weight or this consensus based on all of these signals, and these signals can be computed by you on your end or verified on your end if you want. So giving grants to these aggregators, and we talked about these entities like Ethereum Foundation or the Western Foundation or Nest giving grants for this.
Thanks a lot. And finally, we're doing really great on time, by the way. Thank you all. Last session to review here is giving comfort, legal and social comfort, to decision makers so they feel comfortable making decisions. Who is in this session who would like to share the thoughts?
I can summarize it briefly.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
So the two types of comfort that were mooted were legal comfort and social comfort. Discussions about one were more successful than the other. Social comfort, there is none, basically. That was the conclusion that was reached. People have rhino hide. That's how they go to work every day. But I think the discussions around that probably can be had again, and maybe there's something there in the future. But practical and pragmatic steps about legal comfort were discussed, and it was felt by a couple of people who go out to work in this space and have profiles and are exposed in it that professional liability insurance is something people should consider, or some information about that kind of thing should be promulgated, because some people were aware of it and have it, and others not so much. So that's something that we can help provide information on, and maybe taking the temperature on how various jurisdictions deal with value-bearing open source software projects, and have done historically, so that people, when making decisions about whether to act in a certain way or not act in a certain way, have some sense of their liability, or some sense of the way that the law looks at liability in open source situations. And so that's, again, sort of a practical bit of review, a legal opinion that we can commission and find the most analogous situations, even though there won't be perfectly mapping. There are probably more things that can be done, but the objective was to try and start the discussion around how people can be given comfort so that they don't feel more exposed than they are or than they should. So that was that.
So that concludes the group reflection session.
They're also encouraged to have
Yeah, I mean, if you wanna say something, Ashley from Web3 has a message.
It's the AMA tomorrow, 10 to 12.
Oh, well, yeah, so there's, I guess, an AMA tomorrow from 10 to 12. How are we even doing that?
On Reddit.
It's on Reddit, okay.
Yeah.
All right,
So
cool. I didn't know if it was going to be... Cool. So that, but I think like the group of people here wanted to make sure that everyone who might be watching the live stream understood that this was not by any means an official gathering or kind of like had any bearing on the future of Ethereum governance, but that we should all feel empowered to kind of have conversations and to kind of like define together as a community what this would look like. So hopefully we can find more ways to do that. This group just was in Toronto for EdCon, so EdCon will be how we feel after the next couple of days, I'm sure. But yeah, I think it's important that like we understand mechanisms for community to engage and help define this. So.
Well said. Thank you, Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this was a really great discussion, and we strongly encourage other people who care about Ethereum governance to have these kinds of meetings and share or not share with the community any ideas or conclusions from that as well. So with that said, I want to thank everyone here for coming and making this a really, really great first day of the EIP0 Summit. I really enjoyed the conversations I was a part of. I've heard great feedback from other people so far. That said, if you have any feedback that you would like to share with the organizers or questions ahead of day 2, you can ping me. My email address again is up on the board here, or I'm in the Telegram group as well at John_Light. If you have any notes or pictures that you've taken throughout the event, even if you're not an official note taker, and you feel comfortable sharing those with the rest of the group, please take a picture, or if they're digitally taken, just share a link in the Telegram group, or again, you can just email it to me directly at my email address, and I'm gonna compile all of this stuff into a big document or cloud drive and then share it back with the group so that we can all have a record of the great conversations that have transpired here today. So a quick just review of what's going on tomorrow. In the morning, as Ashley mentioned, we have a public live stream that's going to be happening here in this exact spot from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. The idea is it's going to be taking questions and doing Q&A basically with folks on Reddit and YouTube and all the other places that will be sending questions in, as well as just getting some input and some ideas and having some two-way dialogue with the folks who are watching at home. And perhaps some of those ideas or questions can inform the discussions that we'll be having later in the afternoon. So after that live stream session, you all are free to come or not come, but the official kind of EIP0 Summit stuff starts at noon. We're going to have the first session starting at noon, more or less, so please be here at noon. And then we're going to have lunch, followed by a second session in the afternoon and another group reflection section like this before we have a public meetup in this space to, again, open up the discussion to a broader audience and share what we've learned, as well as start to get some more ideas from people who are outside of this room. Two final things to note here. So once again, this is a community-supported event. If you liked lunch today, thank you everyone who has donated Ether so far. You helped pay for that. If you have not made a donation contribution yet, we would sincerely appreciate if you sent Ether to their QR code. There's also a hyperlink listed there. It's EIP0.tk if you prefer to do this from your laptop or whatever is convenient for you. And finally, right after this, at 6 o'clock, we'll all go out and meet and reconverge for dinner. The dinner location is not yet written on this whiteboard, but by 6 o'clock it will be. I will also post the address in the Telegram group if anyone has to run out for any reason. So just check the Telegram group for the dinner address if you're not here to check it out on the whiteboard. That's it. So feel free to break, chat, whatever, and we'll meet for dinner at 6 o'clock.